So welcome everyone to our first webinar for Polybiotics, this PCOS Awareness Month. My name is Dr. Amina Hersi and I am the founder of Polybiotics, who is sponsoring this webinar. I am a GP and I was diagnosed with PCOS at the age of 19. I'm now 35 and I have lived many years with this condition. And it wasn't until I was in my early 30s that I started to take my PCOS seriously. We have every Wednesday at the same time, 8:30, and now you've signed up for this one, you can attend all of the other webinars as well. Next week will be on movement and PCOS with a physiotherapist, and then we have our rest session with myself talking about sleep and the importance of sleep in a condition like PCOS. And then we have a mindfulness, a special coach who will be life coach, who will be talking to us about mindfulness and well-being, mental well-being with PCOS. So very exciting month ahead. So today's host is Elle. Elle is a behavior health researcher and a nutritionist, an accredited nutritionist, and that's a really important thing to note because Elle's education in nutrition isn't something that she spent a few hours doing on an online course. This is something she's been doing for years, and she is very, very experienced in this and has a lot of expertise. Elle is the lead of Living Nutrition, and I've just put the website for Living there. It's a digital clinic that specializes in gentle nutrition, which is what I always talk about, is gentle nutrition, because you have to be gentle with us because we have a very high risk of eating disorders. So we have to be very careful with how we talk about nutrition in these spaces. And Elle specializes in gentle nutrition for PCOS, pre-diabetes, women's health in general. And her research interests include behavior change interventions, which support management of conditions like PCOS, diabetes, long-term health conditions. And in particular, her work includes improving, sticking to nutrition interventions such as diabetes prevention programs. And she has worked in the NHS for programs aimed at people with diabetes. So without further ado, I'll hand over to Elle.
My master's degree, so I had an undergraduate degree. Though I mostly want to talk about myth busting today, I thought it'd be quite helpful just to give a bit of background into nutrition and PCOS. So just to kind of make sure that we're all on a bit of a level playing field, but also just to kind of help explain why sort of some of the myths are prevalent, I guess, and why certain topics tend to come about, really. So we'll work through nutrition foundations, bit of putting it into practice, and then some of the myth busting slides as well. Start with building a PCOS friendly diet, and actually with this one I can just jump straight into the next slide as well. So firstly, let's think about, is there actually a single best diet for PCOS? A few years ago, a sort of publication was put together called the International Evidence-Based Guideline for Assessment and Management of Polycystic Ovary Syndrome, bit of a mouthful, and that built on some previous guidelines that had just originally been published by a small handful of universities, and they took it into an international evidence body. And they mostly focus on the sort of diagnosis and medical side of things, but on the lifestyle and dietary side, they essentially state that there is no evidence to support any one type of diet composition over another for, and they sort of somewhat wordily put it, anthropomorphic, metabolic, hormonal, reproductive, or psychological outcomes. So what that means in plain English really is that there's no single diet that's best for managing PCOS. And that could be in terms of things like managing symptoms such as acne, sort of body hair or male pattern baldness, in terms of things like fertility, diabetes risk, and even mental health, because PCOS can have quite strong associations with disordered eating and eating disorders. Regardless of which one of these we're looking at, there's not really a single dietary approach that is sort of the only one approach that is suitable for PCOS. But we do have some good evidence for certain principles that might be helpful. If we jump onto the next slide, I'll start to talk you through onto those. I think one of the biggest things that can be helpful to understand here is that there's an overlap between the pathways associated with both PCOS and insulin. And in around 70% of PCOS cases, people also experience insulin resistance. Insulin resistance is something that can increase your risk of developing conditions like type 2 diabetes. It may well be that you might be experiencing the beginning of insulin resistance, but if you're taking a blood test to look at your blood sugar or your blood glucose levels, that's not necessarily tracking quite yet, because you might have the sort of predisposition or the early stages of insulin resistance, but either because perhaps you're a bit younger, you may be managing your PCOS and blood glucose levels, you might not actually be seeing that translated into higher blood glucose levels quite yet. So it can be a bit tricky to immediately actually spot if you're someone who has insulin resistance. However, this is very common in PCOS, and so a lot of the time we do tend to assume that there is a certain element of insulin resistance, or one of these hormonal pathways are kind of influencing the other. Insulin is a hormone that's produced by the pancreas, and its role in our body is to essentially tell our cells to take up sugar or glucose in the bloodstream, so that then our cells can utilize them for energy production. And where insulin resistance happens, your body will then try and produce more insulin to try and make up for the fact that our cells aren't quite so sensitive to the amount of insulin that they're sort of swimming around with, let's say. And so the way this works, though, is if there's extra insulin, that's not just happening in the bloodstream, that's happening everywhere in the body, including in the ovaries. And what this can do is this can drive higher level of testosterone, so male hormones, or we often call them male hormones, but we do have them in both women and men. And these higher testosterone levels can impact things like ovulation. And this is where it kind of comes into an association with PCOS. And then because of this, eating in a way that supports blood glucose management may help to manage PCOS symptoms. It doesn't mean being afraid of carbohydrates. And if there's one thing we take away from this sort of this presentation today, I really hope it's that there's no need to be afraid of any food, especially not carbohydrates. That being said, aiming for foods that are sustaining and satiating is often a core component of managing PCOS, because there's such a tight link for many people between insulin resistance and PCOS. So what this actually looks like, if we jump onto the next slide, we can see some kind of ideas of eating for blood glucose support. And at its most broad level, eating for kind of good blood glucose management will include fruits and vegetables, whole grains, pulses, lean meats if you eat animal products, also plant proteins, things like fish and seafood, nuts and seeds, dairy, fortified alternatives. And essentially, this might well sound like any other generalized healthy eating guidelines. And the nice thing is actually, if you are sort of following these general principles, you may well be closer to managing your PCOS than you might necessarily think about. To then kind of fine tune this into an approach that's better for blood glucose management is when we're looking at pairing some of these foods and relative portions. If we jump slides, I'll show you onto that. So one of the main starting points that's often used for this is the T-plate model. It's a little bit basic, it's a little bit simplified, but it's just a kind of a starting point that suggests if you're building a meal, trying to have roughly half of your plate being fruit and veg, roughly a quarter of your plate being carbohydrates, preferably higher fibre or whole grain variety if possible, and around 25% being protein. As I say, it's a little bit simplified. It's depending on your circumstances, you might find something like a thirds plate, where it's a third carbohydrates, third protein, third fruits and veg, might be more suited for you, but it can be a helpful starting point. Not all meals obviously look like this. We're not always eating meat and 2 veg, but let's say, for example, and if we jump slides, you're having a one-pot dish such as a soup, a stew, or even a salad. It's probably a little bit hard to visualize this, but if you imagine, particularly if you're the person preparing a meal, roughly how many veg are going into that meal, roughly how many whole grains, roughly how much protein. If you know kind of vaguely in your head that it's somewhat adhering to that model, then you're probably in a pretty good place. And the one thing the T plate model always tends to overlook is fats, and I often put it as a little circle in the center of that pie chart, and that's imagining that if you're adding fats, it's maybe a tablespoon sized portion of fats, generally unsaturated, suggested, but it could also be included in the food. So if you're having oily fish, then you've got some good healthy fats in there, but they're sort of they're sat there with the protein portion as well. So that's main meals. If we're then looking at snacks, realistically, you're probably not going to be having a miniature T plate model every time you try and have a snack. And so if you are someone who finds it helpful to have snacks between meals, not everyone does, but if that's you, then generally an approach I've often heard sort of finds useful for my clients is to aim for kind of 2 out of the 3 of proteins, fiber, or some form of sort of unsaturated fat. And the idea there is that you're getting a snack that's going to keep you fuller for longer. And quite often this means pairing a couple of ingredients, so fruit with nuts, for example, crackers and cheese, cottage cheese if you like it, or another alternatively, hummus and veg sticks, apple slices or celery with peanut butter. Yogurts don't just have to be part of a breakfast bowl. You could have a snack-sized bit of natural Greek yogurt with some berries or other seasonal fruit. You can even go for things like homemade trail mix, or edamame beans naturally contains both fiber and protein. And even things like lean meat sort of portions. I think we often think about snacks as having to be their own little mini meals sometimes, but snacks can be really, really simple, 1 or 2 ingredients. And so if you are someone who eats meat and you've got some, let's say, leftover chicken breast, and you just want to have a small amount of, a snack size amount of that, then that's giving you some protein in there. The main thing here is by combining the two, you'll keep fuller for longer. And I just briefly wanted just to touch on cultural foods, because I do think a lot of the advice, particularly when we're in the UK, are very sort of Western diet focused, and sometimes they can sort of suggest that cultural foods are perhaps less healthy. And so what I'd suggest, just because we don't have too many PCOS resources or advice available at the moment, is that looking at sort of healthy eating or diabetes guidance can be a helpful stopgap for examples of how to include cultural foods in a way that supports your PCOS. So for example, here we've got the Eat Well guide that's just been tailored to West African ingredients. You can see the Eat Well guide here, it looks a bit closer to a thirds plate than a T plate model, but you can still adjust those relative portions based on what feels good for your body. And I'd also suggest sort of diversifying your social media feed if you're following sort of health professionals or chefs. And if you're following people from different backgrounds, then you're more likely to get that better representation of different cultures of foods, particularly if you yourself come from a different food culture and you feel like it's not particularly well represented in the people or that you follow, or the places that you go for health advice. So that's just a brief aside there. And then this allows us to move on to myth busting for PCOS, which I hope will be the kind of meaty, helpful bit for today's presentation. So I thought I'd firstly start with gluten. Gluten, I think, particularly when I was first looking at PCOS for my own benefit, but then also doing my training as a nutritionist and starting to think about what areas I want to specialize in, gluten was definitely one of the sort of big baddies of PCOS. And in many places you look, even places that might otherwise offer quite good health information, could be quite cautious or even outright banning gluten as an option. Now, part of the theorized link, for first, I should say, is there really are no good studies that suggest there is an association between negative PCOS outcomes and gluten. But part of the theorized link between PCOS and gluten are based around the fact that PCOS as a condition can have people who experience PCOS facing slightly higher levels of inflammation in the body, and being in a more inflamed state, or eating a more inflammatory diet may be linked with those sort of PCOS symptoms that we're hoping to avoid. And so if you're someone who has some form of gluten intolerance, that could be a non-celiac intolerance, could be irritable bowel disease or syndrome, or another issue. If you're just not getting on with gluten particularly well, then that might be making your diet more pro-inflammatory, which could be having a bit of a negative impact on your PCOS. But another slightly more simple difference in cutting out gluten and your PCOS symptoms can be that because going gluten-free can be a bit restrictive, in more recent years there's been much more options offered for gluten-free, but particularly in the past where gluten-free was a real challenge, you can really be changing your diet. Let's say you go out to meet a friend for coffee. If there's not many gluten-free options, then you might have been planning to have cake, but you might end up skipping it. Or alternatively, you might end up choosing a sort of lower calorie or lower sugar or sort of more fibrous option. And what that can do is it might be having a kind of knock-on effect of managing blood glucose levels or promoting weight loss, not really because of the gluten, but just because it's limiting your food choices and changing your food choices. The one aside I always make around gluten, though, is that if you do have celiac disease, then it's absolutely essential that you completely avoid gluten, as even trace amounts can sort of trigger reactions, and your sensitivity can increase with each exposure. So if there's intolerances, you probably want to be avoiding it, especially if you've got celiac. But it might also just be that it's changing your eating habits. Then on a similar vein to gluten, we have dairy. And in much the same way, there's not really any studies to suggest that dairy has a negative impact on PCOS. And in fact, when we're looking at things like the diabetes risk that PCOS can often be linked with, dairy is actually linked to a decreased risk of developing type 2 diabetes. It's complete protein, it's satiating, it's supportive of blood glucose levels. If it's a full fat variety, you'll be better absorbing certain vitamins such as vitamin D and E. And so dairy can be quite a helpful part of the diet. Like with gluten, if you are someone who experiences some form of dairy intolerance, then it may well be that your body's not getting on with dairy anyway, and so it's not going to be helping your PCOS symptoms. Because PCOS does have that link with acne, some people are a little bit cautious of dairy because of acne. However, in reality, what we find is a really, really small percentage of people have dairy-related acne. And what we do find is that that is much more likely to occur. In fact, there's only really strong evidence for it occurring when people are having low-fat dairy as opposed to full-fat. And so, firstly, there's a very good chance that you don't have a dairy and acne link going on. But if you are one of the sort of people who think you might do, then maybe just double check, are you having low or full fat dairy? Because it might be that you tolerate full fat better. And so maybe that's just a minor adjustment rather than a complete cutting out of food that you have to go through. And then just as an aside, full fat dairy can be helpful for absorption of inositol, which is always great. Then we've got our alternative milks, which I think ironically it used to be that dairy was the one of the sort of big things that people wanted to avoid, whereas I think now it's probably oat milk these days. I'll briefly touch on seed oils just because one of the things that certain, I guess, groups will say is a bad thing about oat milk is that they quite often contain a small amount of rapeseed oil, and that's essentially because dairy naturally contains fat. When food producers are making these alternative milks, they want to kind of mimic the consistency and the sort of composition of these milks as closely as they can. And so they'll add a very small amount of rapeseed oil to help with the emulsification and the ability for this oat milk to kind of froth up like a barista style milk. I could talk about this all day, but in a nutshell, seed oils are not associated with ill health or inflammation as they sometimes get reported to. A very brief overview, it's certain part, if when you break down the components of seed oils, they contain omega-6, which is similar to omega-3 fatty acids, and one or two of those kind of subcomponents has previously been associated with a more pro-inflammatory pathway when we look at it quite in minute detail, just looking at those sort of individual compounds. But when we take a step back and actually look at how people eat seed oils such as rapeseed oil in their day-to-day life, and when we look at levels of inflammation in people who routinely consume seed oils, is actually they have lower levels of inflammation. So it's just, if you isolate individual components, you can almost always find something negative about them. But quite often our bodies work that way, is that different components go into different pathways, and some are generally better, some are a bit worse. Quite often they do a bit of both. But when we actually look at it in a real life environment rather than a really zoomed in setup, seed oils are fine. When it comes to oat milk and blood glucose levels, which is probably the other thing that people tend to be worried about with oat milk, or at least at the moment. Firstly, there's a little bit of misinformation about the chemical composition of oats and sort of how much of an increase in blood sugars they have. And in reality, it's a little bit lower than what people might expect. You'll see on the next slide in a minute or two the sort of GI levels. I wouldn't worry too much about glycemic index, but I just wanted to sort of illustrate that although oat milk does have a higher glycemic index than dairy and soy, it's not as high as you may see on some outlets where they suggest it's over 100. That's very much not the case. But also in practice, other than maybe a latte or a cappuccino, you're probably not drinking oat milk mostly on its own. You're probably taking it as part of a porridge or another breakfast option. And so we're not always drinking these milks just on their own in a glass. The one thing I would say though, is that oat milk does lack the protein that you see in dairy and soy, as do almond and rice milk. They're also quite low in protein. And so just on a PCOS and blood glucose management side of things, if you are wanting to utilize your milk as an additional protein source, then soy or dairy might be the better option for you. And just a note on fortification, I'm personally a fan of fortification, which means I go for the non-organic alternative milks, because one of the rules of organic milks is that they can't be fortified. But when these alternative milks are fortified, it means that they have any component that they add in, they aim to match it with the amount that you'd find in dairy. So calcium, vitamin D, you'll even get some with iodine added. So those are all things you kind of want to have in the diet there. So personally, a big fan of the fortified alternatives. Perfect. We'll then go on to seed cycling. You may have heard of seed cycling when you're thinking about things like menstrual cycle regularity, is where you'll most likely find seed cycling mentioned. And essentially it's a practice of eating different types of seeds based on where you are in your menstrual cycle. So during your follicular stage, that's the first part of your menstrual cycle before you ovulate, you're supposed to eat pumpkin and flax seeds. And then in the second half of your cycle, your luteal phase, you're meant to have sesame and sunflower seeds. Firstly, if you've got PCOS, you probably, or you very may well experience irregular cycles. And even if they're a little bit more regular, it's not always very easy to pinpoint which part of your cycle you're in, unless you're kind of tracking ovulation through strips or temperature tracking. You might not know exactly when you ovulate. You may well have a 3 or 4 week follicular stage and a 2-week luteal stage. So firstly, actually being able to work out where you are in your cycle is easier said than done in PCOS. The reason why these kind of combinations of seeds are suggested is that it's thought that flax seeds and pumpkin seeds might have a slight estrogenic effect. They might mimic estrogen, and that sesame and sunflower seeds might have a sort of a supporting effect for progesterone. In practice, any kind of mimicking effect that these seeds might have is really too minor to change from, essentially a 2-week cycle to the next. And to be honest, that's probably a good thing, because if foods could drastically influence our hormone levels that much, we'd probably be accidentally changing things left, right, and centre. So I really don't think it's a bad thing that seeds have a much more modest effect. That being said, all of these seeds are really great foods for PCOS, and because there might be a very small estrogenic effect from things like flax seeds, you're more likely to hear it being spoken about in terms of the sort of menopause, for example. But if it has a very mild effect, kind of more consistently taking the seeds over the course of, a daily basis or a weekly basis rather than jumping from one to the next, it's probably going to be a lot easier for you to keep track of, and means you're getting that variety of seeds in a much more consistent way. So I'd say skip the seed cycling, but do include the seeds. And then for my final myth that I wanted to talk about, I think I'm mostly on time. I actually didn't put a timer on, so hopefully I'm mostly at the correct pace. But was sort of various forms of fasting. So time-restricted eating, intermittent fasting, and associated kind of habits, I suppose. So you've got intermittent fasting firstly, which I think probably at the moment the most common or the most recognized version is the 5-2 diet, where for 5 days you eat normally, and for 2 non-consecutive days in the week you have a very, very reduced caloric intake. Some people do slightly different variants, but for all intents and purposes you have set days where your calorie intake is very reduced. And then you have time restricted feeding, which puts limitations on when you can eat. So some people have very, very strict narrow eating windows, other people have more relaxed windows. The jury's still really out with these approaches. We just don't really have enough evidence for these two approaches. So far, the strongest evidence we have is that both of these approaches tend to result in caloric restriction. The 5-2 diet, most obviously, because you've got 2 days where you're quite literally depriving yourself of sometimes 1,500 calories per day. So that's each week. That's a 3,000 calorie limitation in what you're eating, which is, it's quite a strong amount to be reducing on a weekly basis. And then in the sense of time restricted eating, if there's large parts of the day where you can't eat, then there's a good chance you're going to end up eating less anyway. There is some evidence of metabolic benefit to fasting. So this is, again, particularly more to do with the time restricted eating. And this does get a little bit more news in the diabetes end of the spectrum, because it is thought that there might be some benefit to insulin resistance and kind of improving your body's sensitivity to insulin resistance, which of course could be beneficial either for people with diabetes or for people with insulin-linked PCOS, which, as a general rule of thumb, you're quite often told to assume that you do unless you know otherwise. The problem is that these are still quite small studies. They're still relatively young studies, and they're often less studied in women. And there's a current thought process, and again, really needs more evidence, that these fasting protocols might be more stressful on women's bodies than men, and that we're more likely for our body to go into starvation mode. Is always a little bit bigger, doesn't always quite track out, but essentially our body's more likely to think that it's in a time where food is not abundant and therefore it needs to sort of protect itself. We don't know exactly, we really don't know enough essentially to be able to sort of prescribe it and be able to guarantee a result. And so it's an approach, I say, that if you think it would work for your body and for your mental health, then it may be something you experiment with. But I would really be cautious that it can have an impact on your relationship with food, or even just your social life. If you're having time restricted eating and it means you can't go out to dinner with friends or family, that might be, not a problem on a day-to-day basis, but when it comes to actually having quality time with people, that could really sort of be a challenge for you. We also have groups, of course, who participate in Ramadan, and that is fasting, and that is done, over the course of a month, and do so healthily and do so well. But again, it's about working out what's right for your body and what's right for your overall health, your mental health as well as your physical health. And so what I might suggest as an alternative approach, if you are curious about the concept of time-restricted feeding, is just see how long you have between dinner or your last meal of the day and your breakfast. If you're having an evening meal at 7 o'clock and then you're having your breakfast at 7, 7:30, then you've already done a fast. And that 12-hour fast is, often very sufficient to give our body a bit of break from digestion, to support with that insulin sensitivity that we mentioned before. And it doesn't impact too much on your day and on your social life as well. So the jury is still out with that one, but I'd just say cautious if you're interested in it, cautiously approach what feels realistic to you. And again, you can always, stagger your way in. You don't need to jump straight into the deep end with these kind of things. It doesn't have to be all or nothing with your nutrition. You can find what works for you. So I think I've mostly kept to time there, hopefully, which means if there are questions either in the chat or hands up, I'm very happy to take them. But yeah, just remember that PCOS, it is a chronic condition, it's a lifelong condition. So it shouldn't be about crash diets or exercise as punishment. It should be about working with your body and kind of gently finding out what works for it without, critique or punishment if things aren't always immediately apparent.
Amazing. Thank you so much, Elle. Everyone, you are welcome to, you can you can send me a private message and anonymously ask a question, or if you want to, you can speak, or if you want to, you can send it in the chat. But happy to take any questions at all. I'll give you a few moments to write that. Anyone want to put up their hand? Anyone want to message anything? I can go back to any slide. Oh, yep, the questions are coming through. Okay, so what should a diet focus on satiety include?
Great question. So the satiety would be those pairings of things that contain, in particular, protein and fiber. And the reason for this is protein and fiber take longer to be digested. They take longer to move through our digestive system, which means we feel fuller for longer. And that's what satiety is essentially. It's feeling satisfied, feeling sort of full or satiated essentially for longer. How that looks for you will vary. As I said, some people are snackers, some aren't, and that's really up to what suits your body. But it's about those pairings and it's about those building of the balanced approaches that includes those different food groups. Fats as well can help to slow down the digestion of a meal. And so let's say if you're taking a pasta dish, it wouldn't be about chucking, pasta out the cupboard, but it would be having a look at your portions. If you're having spaghetti bolognese, having plenty of veg in that bolognese mix, and then you have either your mince, whether that's an animal one, an alternative, or lentils if that's your preference. And that way you're building in protein, you're building in fiber, and you're supporting that carbohydrate. So I hope that helps as an example.
Thank you. And yet, in terms of high fiber foods, what, sometimes we think of fiber as something, fiber gel or those powders or whatever, but it'd be great to just talk about what sort of foods are high in fiber for people to have.
Absolutely. So often it's doesn't have to be, the really sort of, foods you think of as being really heavy and dense. I mean, certainly those can be, but, even something like, I always think I cannot remember the amount of fiber they have per cup or per 100 grams off the top of my head, but raspberries always surprises me because it's such a, it's a high water content food, and yet it's really, really quite high in fiber, despite the fact that you wouldn't really know it to eat it. Or even avocados, which, because they've got such a high fat content, we often don't really think of them as a fiber source, but they really are. Essentially, fiber comes from plant-based foods, so you don't get fiber from animal products like meat or dairy. So if you're having plant-based foods, whether that is fruit and veg, whether it's pulses, nuts and seeds, whole grains, in almost all of these foods, there will be fiber. And a really easy way to keep the fiber content high is to go for whole grain varieties, or if you're having your sort of things like vegetables, give them a clean, but maybe don't peel them if that's appropriate for the dish you're having. I think I pretty much only peel potatoes if I'm doing mashed potatoes these days. I'm too lazy to peel, everything just goes straight into the pot. So that's a really easy way to increase your fiber. But even things like nuts and seeds, particularly if they're not blanched, they've still got that kind of skin on the outside. Those are fiber sources as well. So if you're including different plant foods, and that, doesn't have to mean eating vegetarian, it just means, all of these foods I just mentioned there, they'll help to increase your fiber content. If you're having, again, those balanced meals, you're having those sort of fiber sources throughout the day, then you won't even really need to track it. If you're really curious, you can always track, do 1 or 2 days where you track your intake. But I'd say you'd be surprised at if, so long as you're sort of including whole foods essentially throughout your day, you'll probably get there without having to count it.
One of my favorite hacks that you mentioned is I always have like frozen mixed veg in the freezer, and I will add it to like any kind of bolognese or whatever sauce I'm making, and it just, sneak the veggies in whichever way you can. Great, thank you. Some more questions coming through. So the next one is very specific. What are your thoughts about pea protein, like pea milk? Sorry.
I've never actually tried pea milk itself, although I've read about it a lot. Actually, no, I tell a lie. I did once try one that was half semi-skim milk, half pea milk, which I thought was quite an odd approach. It's a bit like those beef burgers where they're half beef, half vegetable protein. Um, I think it was just probably on offer, so it ended up in the shopping basket. It's, I think the main thing with pea milk is quite often there's a bit of disguising of taste that happens. But if you like the taste and you can easily access pea milk, then it's an absolutely fine option. And yes, actually, it will have a slightly higher protein content compared to most of the other alternative milks. I don't think it's quite as high as soy milk, if I remember off the top of my head.
Mm.
But yeah, if it's something you've got access to and you like the taste, then absolutely, it's another option to include there, and it's usually a low allergen option as well.
Yeah, amazing. And it's interesting. I think pea milk, it has high protein, but it's not a complete protein. Like, doesn't have, when we say complete protein, we're talking about the 9 essential amino acids, the building blocks of proteins that our bodies use. So it doesn't have all 9, but I'm assuming that cow's milk does have.
Yeah. So yeah, with the complete proteins, it just means there's sufficient amount of each amino acid that they can kind of count it as having all of them being included. Um, so most plant foods, with a few exceptions, aren't complete proteins, but so long as you're having a variety of foods throughout the day, you'll still get the protein in. Or if you're having animal foods as well, you'd have, it doesn't matter if you're not having them in the same setting, you don't have to, or the same sitting, you don't have to have a complete protein each meal, but so long as you're getting those different proteins, different amino acids across the day, it's okay.
Perfect. Then we have a question about, are low GI carbs preferred for PCOS, or is that a myth?
Yeah, great question again. So the issue with low GI is that, so GI or glycemic index is a measure of how much a food will increase blood glucose levels essentially, and it goes from a scale of 1 to 100, although you do get a few rare exceptions where they try and count them as over 100. It can be helpful in the sense that generally foods that are lower GI will have less of an impact on your blood glucose levels, and generally there'll be the carbohydrates that are more fiber based. They're more likely to be a whole grain carbohydrate. The issue with glycemic index is it doesn't take the context and that we eat into account. So one example I often see used is that a chocolate bar is going to quite often have a lower GI score than watermelon, and that's because chocolate has fat in it as well as sugar. But I think your average person would recognize that having fruit is generally a better choice to go for than chocolate. Obviously, both very, very much welcome in the diet. But because watermelon's got very high water content, the actual amount of watermelon that you would eat in the context of that GI label doesn't really translate into how you'd eat it into real life. Or alternatively, if you've got a food where it might have a high GI, but then you're combining it with a source of protein or another source of fiber, then that it almost effectively lowers its GI. And so what you'll instead sometimes see spoken about is glycemic load. And that is essentially taking glycemic index into the account of how we actually eat these foods. And so it's a little bit more helpful, but it's a lot easier to look up GI values. So I'd say looking at the GI score can be a kind of helpful rule of thumb just to get a vague sense of where a food sits, but absolutely don't be married to it. And just, you can always make a meal a bit more balanced. If you're someone who prefers white rice, you don't have to stop eating it. But if you're cooking it alongside proteins, then you'll probably still be getting a balanced meal, even though you're technically going for a lower GI carbohydrate there. So I hope that's helpful.
Thank you so much. The questions are coming through thick and fast. We've got some more. Okay, so will eating healthy fats still impact on my weight loss journey as it's still a fat?
Yep. So the reason why we often get told to have low fat diets is gram per gram, fats are higher in calories than protein and carbohydrates. Protein carbohydrates generally have around 4 calories per gram, whereas fats are more like 9 calories. So fats are more calorie dense. What I'd suggest is just being a little bit portion aware, and that doesn't need to be in the sense of measuring out your food necessarily, but if you're cooking, just being vaguely aware of how much oil are you cooking in or are you adding to foods, because fat food, foods that are high in fat will be higher in calorie, but they can often be very nutrient dense and sort of really supportive for our body overall. So if you are someone who you are on a weight loss journey and you're perhaps aware of the caloric intake of foods you're having, I'd always suggest slow and steady approach anyway over dieting. But it might just be that you're including those healthy fats, but you're just sort of being a bit portion aware there. Some foods you'll have, if you're someone who eats salmon, then that will be a more calorie dense meal, but you're getting quite a good payoff for some really good omega-3s in there. So still include them, but it might just be that you're a bit strategic about when you have them or how much, if that's helpful.
Thank you. And interestingly, I'm in the process of becoming a training in obesity medicine. And one of the interesting things that I was learning was that on a weight loss journey, you are advised to have fats regularly because
Mm,
your gallbladder helps you digest fat and it releases this fluid that bile and if you don't eat fats, you can, especially as you're losing weight, increase your risk of gallstones. So
mm,
a little bit of healthy fat in your diet will help to sort of lubricate that process and actually reduce your risk of having troublesome gallstones. So
mm.
fats are important, and even with the very low calorie diets that I've been reading about, they still advise a small amount of healthy fats like olive oil, avocado, those sort of things in the diet for that reason.
Definitely. Yeah.
And they're very filling as well. So yes, they
Yes.
are dense, but you will feel fuller for longer. And
And they make food taste better. You will food taste so much nicer with a little bit of fat included. So yeah, there's definitely room for it.
no need to punish ourselves and deprive ourselves of healthy fats. Thank you. Next question is, could you give some insight into teas like spearmint and their benefits for PCOS?
Yeah, absolutely. I love spearmint for PCOS. I think the hardest thing is actually getting spearmint because most teas will be peppermint. So I tend to just buy like a bulk bag of dried spearmint and then put that in one of those posh little teapots with the strainers built in. But spearmint is So they most tend to suggest spearmint for hirsutism, which is sort of that kind of excess hair that we sometimes experience with PCOS. The studies that have looked at spearmint, they've been quite small, and there's not been strong enough evidence to categorically say, yes, it reduces unwanted body hair in people with PCOS. It looks like it might have an anti-androgen, which is androgen is the term for hormones that we typically associate with sort of male bodies, so testosterone, for example. And spearmint is meant to have an anti-androgen effect if you take 2 cups of spearmint tea per day. What I'd suggest, and same for trying any kind of supplement or herb or spice, is to try it consistently for up to 6 months. And if it's something you enjoy or you notice makes a difference, then continue with it. But if you don't notice a difference and it's not something you're particularly fussed about, then feel free to discontinue.
Thank you. Next question is there any known link between PCOS and ultra processed foods?
To my knowledge, there's not been any PCOS specific study on ultra processed foods. It's a very grey area because the kind of classification for ultra processed foods wasn't really made for us as consumers using it. It was a research group, I think in Mexico, or no, Brazil, actually, I tell a lie, that kind of use this category, and essentially completely unprocessed foods, minimally processed foods, which does technically include things, chopping carrots as a form of processing, moderately processed foods, so that could be like a homemade cake, and then ultra processed foods is where you're starting to introduce ingredients that you might not necessarily see in a home kitchen, for example. I think it's just a case of being pragmatic with it. I think we instinctively know that certain foods are less health promoting for us. They used to be called junk food. They used to probably just be called processed foods, to be fair. And now they're kind of labeled as ultra processed foods. But on the flip side, there can be some foods that technically count as ultra processed, but can be helpful in the diet. I know many of us rely on things like shop bought bread, and these foods can be fortified as well. So it's been a little bit pragmatic about it. A lot of shop bought foods often slide into the ultra processed category just because they need a few additional ingredients to make them shelf stable for an extra couple of days. And I think it's being fair to yourself as well. We're not here to eat, be on a race to eat the purest diet that is, that we've had to work the hardest to prepare. It's okay to take the shortcuts like getting the tinned foods and things, and that's not going to be harmful to our health. And it's important to have that level of enjoyment in your eating as well without any guilt. So it'll be interesting to see if there's a PCOS specific study further down the line. At the moment, they're quite broad, looking at people's sort of health and weight loss. But I'd just say treat it in a similar way to how we probably would have previously treated, I hate the term junk food, but what would have been called junk food previously, and give yourself, that bit of space to eat in a way that suits really, and to not feel guilty if you have to do a few, helping hands to be able to actually, get dinner on the table.
Definitely agree with that. I think social media especially has this habit of, something gets vilified at a particular time in time, and it especially with PCOS, a lot of things get vilified at certain periods of time. There was a time that almond milk was at the center of some controversy, oat milk, then dairy, gluten, all of the things we talked about, and now it's tinned foods, all sorts of things. So I think it can be really overwhelming. Like basically you feel like you can't eat anything if you stick to every rule that you come across. And that's why it's really important that you have like what we call a sustainable diet, something you can do long term, and also something that financially is not going to put you out as well. Because a lot of these things, there is a financial burden in eating organic, completely unprocessed foods, or even just in terms of time as well. Having the time to make this. If buying store-bought bread means that you save X amount of hours a week, that is good for your mental health, then you might prefer to buy the store-bought bread because you don't have time to bake your own bread. So yeah, factoring that in as well. Great. So next question is fermented foods like kimchi for gut health. Would this be recommended too?
Yeah, they're great things to include in the diet, and there's definitely some suggestion that supporting your gut health can be a positive step towards managing your PCOS. And again, I think that probably we'll find as we do more research that links into the inflammation side of things. You don't just have to have fermented foods, you can have prebiotic foods, and actually kimchi is quite cool in that it's both pre and probiotic because the sort of cabbage and similar foods that tend to go into making kimchi are really good for actually feeding our existing gut microbiome. We don't just want to be adding in new bacteria. We want to be supporting the bacteria that's already living in our guts. So kimchi is actually a really cool one in that you both get prebiotics, that food for your gut microbiome, as well as probiotics. It's very difficult to quantify the exact impact of fermented foods just because they're not kind of, medical level like a probiotic supplement, but we're reasonably confident that they're good foods to have, and particularly for things like probably more so the kimchis and the sauerkrauts and the yogurts or kefirs over just the fermented drinks, because the fermented drinks you're probably just getting the bacteria, whereas those other foods you're getting nutrition for yourself and for your gut microbiome as well. But yeah, great and very tasty foods to include.
Great. And then we have a question that says there are write-ups about reducing sugar intake with PCOS. How does this relate back to fruits, given they are naturally high in sugar? Are the fruits to avoid, are there fruits to avoid or limit versus those that are great to consume with PCOS?
Really interesting question. So firstly, to look at the sugar side of things, sugar I'd kind of sort of often break into two categories, and I'd ignore the kind of concept of refined and unrefined sugar that you'll sometimes see online, because you'll get things like honey and maple syrup will be, a food of a sort of health food will say that it's free from refined sugars, and then it's made with maple syrup, which, although if you were to absolutely minutely analyze it, there'd maybe be some trace minerals in there. There's really not enough to make any positive health difference to us. And for all intents and purposes, our bodies are just viewing, maple syrup is the same as table sugar. It's for all intents and purposes, it's sugar. What we instead tend to use in nutrition research is free versus non-free sugars. So a free sugar would be things like those table sugars, syrups, things that you add and it's pretty much 100% sugar. And also to a lesser extent, fruit juices do come into this category because they've kind of been broken apart from their cellular structure. And quite often we've completely removed and strained out the fiber there as well. If you think how many oranges would you likely eat in one sitting versus how much orange juice could you drink in one sitting, you could probably drink, 10 oranges very, very easily in a very, very short amount of time. Then you've got the non-free sugars, and those are the ones where, like fruit, for example, or actually milk. Interestingly, milk is just about the only animal source of sugar or carbohydrate, because they're bound up in other structures. In the case of milk, kind of protein and fats. In the case of fruits, those sugars are sort of very much locked up within the cellular structure, and there's a lot of fiber to break down before you get to the sugars there. It means that they have a much different impact on our bodies, the same compared to those free sugars where they're already in quite a simple form and are very easy to digest. In terms of fruit, so for the most part, I'd say really don't be afraid or limiting fruit. The slight exception I'd say is, the suggested portion for fruit is 2, maybe 3 portions of fruit a day. Preferably maybe having those 2 portions at different times. If you're having them, if we go back, thinking about that balanced snack slide, whether you're having the fruits with with yogurt or with nuts or peanut butter, then you're just creating a more satiating snack anyway. So if you compare like to like of, if you're looking at your blood sugar levels, strictly speaking, a fruit would have a higher increase in your blood glucose level than most vegetables or even, fruit paired with a fat or protein source. But I really wouldn't worry about it. Firstly, I mean, even I'd only really be looking at it if you had type 1 diabetes or a type 2 diabetes that needs a lot of support. And in terms of different types of sugars, although strictly speaking, tropical fruits tend to be a bit higher in sugar. Again, for the way that we tend to eat fruit normally, I really wouldn't worry. The benefit you'll get from fruit, particularly if you're having a couple of different portions of fruit alongside 3 or more portions of veg and a balanced diet, the amount of nutrition that you'll get from fruit will far outweigh the fact that it does technically contain a little bit more sugar. But again, it's coming with fiber. It's you may well be eating it with other foods, so it's a world away from having a tablespoon of sugar out, cast of sugar or something. Not that I think we'd probably do that, but yeah, so definitely don't be afraid of sugar there.
That's great. I think fruit gets a really bad rep as well. Like we're often told, don't eat this, you have to eat berries, don't eat apples, don't eat this. But yeah, with the fiber, your body's working harder to get at that sugar. So it does sort of blunt your body's reaction to that sugar and you handle it better. So it's the benefit is good for you to have fruit. I'm just going to plug in my laptop. Sorry, it's running low on battery.
Yeah, I can see the questions as well if we need
Oh,
to.
perfect. You can see them. I think the next question is about inositol. What do you
Yeah,
think?
so really, that's this is your area.
Um, so Elle actually takes our brand, and it's yeah, I rave about inositol, but in the context of food, the only why I take a inositol supplement is because I wouldn't be able to get the dose of inositol that's effective from food. So that's why a lot of us with PCOS choose to supplement with inositol. And yeah, so I think of it quite highly. I think Elle thinks of it highly. Um, and yeah, it's something to it we always say this I always say this, that food first, it says it literally. It is mandatory for me to put on our nutritional supplement bottles that nutritional supplements are not to replace food. They are there to supplement. That's all they do. So it's important that we think about that first as well. Like always go for as varied diet as possible. And what you can't get from your diet, perhaps things like inositol, vitamin D, then you'll try and get from your supplements. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, to plug your website, you've got really great explanation of why you have inositol based supplements. So I'd definitely recommend taking a read of that. You've got some really great resources on your website there.
And we make sure to like actually reference, it's
Yes.
all fun and games to say, oh yeah, inositol does this and that and the other. But you can tell a brand that understands ingredients if you can see that they are actually saying these studies said this dose of this ingredient helped with this issue. I think that's something we should be discerning and look for when we are shopping for supplements. We have a question on what's your opinion on keto and paleo diet?
Yeah, so paleo, I, I kind of almost ignore completely just because the basis of it, the concept of an ancestral diet, is something that doesn't really exist. Humans have the really cool thing about being a human is that we have evolved to be able to survive off a very, very broad variety of diets. It's why we've managed to populate essentially the entire globe. It's because there is no single paleo diet. Um, think just for brevity's sake, I'll more focus on ketogenic. So the ketogenic diet was actually developed for young people with epilepsy because it fundamentally can change some sort of workings of the brain to reduce the risk of fits. Some people find it helpful in terms of managing their blood glucose levels, because if you're really, really tanking the amount of carbohydrates you're having, then you're not going to see very many variations in your blood glucose levels. You're going to be keeping closer to that sort of steady line. But as humans, we have, we're very good at having carbohydrates. Most healthy sort of diet suggestions will recommend around 50% of your caloric intake coming from carbohydrates. So to go from that to ketogenic is quite a strong difference. Some people do find that, either because of their own preferences around food or their own way that their body manages glucose. And again, this is much more commonly in people with diabetes rather than people with PCOS, or it might be PCOS plus diabetes. That feels like the only way forwards for them. And for a small group of people, keto will be what works for them, and that's fine. But it's a very restrictive diet. It is quite difficult to get enough fiber on a ketogenic diet, and it's very easy to have an awful lot of saturated fat on a ketogenic diet. And these are all things that, despite what some social media influencers will unfortunately say, we have decades of very, very robust evidence that says reducing fiber and increasing saturated fat is really not good for long-term health in terms of cardiovascular health, in terms of certain cancer risks such as bowel and colorectal cancers. And it's likely to be very restrictive in terms of nutrients as well. So I'd say unless ketogenic diet feels like the only way forwards for your body, I'd really advise other approaches. If you want to go low carb and that's what works for your body, there's even a lower or moderate carbohydrate diet is a very, very long way away from a strict ketogenic diet. So for the vast majority of people, I would steer away for it. As I say, there'll always be a small number who it does work for, but for the most part, it's really not one I recommend for most people.
I have had first-hand experience of life on keto. I was on the keto diet for an entire year in 2018, I believe. And yes, I lost loads of weight. It was great in that aspect. However, it stopped me from socializing with my family, with my friends. I felt like I was in a cult. I wouldn't stop talking about it. And what's interesting is that entire year, my periods went berserk. Like I had skipped so many cycles that year. And I believe that it put my body under a lot of stress. And as I have Hashimoto's, I have an underactive thyroid, and I have heard that it's not a good idea if you have thyroid issues to go on these kind of diets. So do definitely speak to your doctor before you undergo such a dramatic change. And Elle mentioned it before as well. Ancestral diets, humans have been eating grains and carbohydrates for millennia. So for us to say that like the ancestral diet is nothing but fat and animal, sources, it is not really accurate in my opinion. Yes, well, yeah, so in my opinion, keto wasn't right for me. However, there are people who say it worked very well for them. And if you are someone who's not having issues with it, I would be very cautious. And also the other thing is if you're prone to eating disorders, as I've experienced eating disorders in the past, it did kind of worsen my sort of eating, the way I had my relationship with food deteriorated, and I became very fixated on what I was going to eat, and very fearful of certain foods, which can drive those like negative thoughts that we have. So I'd be cautious about those sort of things. someone said, thank you for the talk today. It has been super informative. Are there any resources like websites or apps that you would advise to help with understanding the nutrition aspect in further detail?
Yeah, I think I'll give both of us a cheeky plug there. My website's in live. Actually, I've got my old logo on there. My website's actually now in Live and Nutrition. I did a name update a year ago, and I've just realised I put in the wrong
Oh,
headed there on my last slide. But Live and Nutrition is my website, and obviously Polybiotics. I'd say I'd go for that as a first port of call. And both of us are on social media, if, for questions. I've taken a brief hiatus from recording videos just for this part of the year, but I do need to get back onto it. It's just one of these things balancing different roles and responsibilities.
if you are on, if you're on TikTok, going on Elle's page, you can watch Elle's older videos, and Elle talks about what she's eaten that day and things, so there's lots of resources out there. And this is, Elle mentioned it before, it's so important to have a varied social media feed. Having people who look like you or eat like you, so that you can not feel sort of shame for, I don't know, having, for me, for example, cultural foods, there are some places that kind of vilify cultural foods, and making sure that you are so that eating well resources, there's NHS resources specifically for different groups. Yes, it's mainly for people with diabetes, but it still kind of applies to people with PCOS. You could have a look at that NHS resource. And I believe there are some older posts on my social media where I talk about a brand, not a brand, a page that I think it's called Decolonizing Your Plate.
Yes.
Yes.
Yeah.
So I'd have a look at pages like that as well. Um, and just gonna do the last few questions because we want to wrap up before 10. If that's okay, Elle. Oh, am I frozen?
Oh, I can
I
see.
froze for a second.
Okay, if not, I can see the next questions if yours is
Are
frozen.
you okay with
Yeah,
staying
I can
on there?
jump in. So I think the next one says, given that PCOS find it harder to lose weight, but being overweight is often a risk factor for type 2 diabetes and insulin resistance, do you have any advice about how weight loss can be achieved in a healthy manner? So weight loss is a real challenging one, and I think essentially there's not always a right approach. So what I most often work with in my own clinic is gently steering dietary approaches to more health promoting ones without necessarily having to count calories and macros. So things like the tea plate model can be quite nice because it's visual, but you're not having to overly measure out foods. If you find you take that approach and you find you still need support, firstly, I'd check in with your relationship with food, because if you're having any kind of disorder, if you're in any kind of say binge restrict type cycle, then you really need to heal that first before you embark on any kind of weight loss, because firstly, you're much less likely to be successful, but also it's more likely to exacerbate those symptoms and potentially make the binge restrict cycle worse in the future, which is likely to lead to, well, firstly, mental distress. It's weight cycling, of changing your weight can be quite intense on your body. It's better to exist at a slightly bigger body weight than you'd like than put your body through the stress of going through lots of weight cycling, if at all possible. But also, if you do have those kind of disordered relationship with food, your chance of regaining weight is higher as well. So I'd firstly make sure that you have a bit of an honest chat with yourself, I suppose, about where you're at there. I've done some studies looking at managing eating disorders alongside diabetes, and the good thing is it can be done. In terms of, and then, I mean, there are things like the medicated routes, which obviously are getting a lot of media time at the moment. We've got a lot of the diabetes and weight loss landscapes changing very rapidly, with things like diabetes remission programs and GLP-1 agonist medication. With all of these, they are intensive options to be going through. And I think the important thing with them, and I do, I don't think we should demonize people for going down these routes, because particularly if you are in PCOS, there's a good chance you're in a body where you are essentially having more of an uphill battle to live in what someone else will consider to be a normal body weight for the amount of effort that you're putting in. And so I don't think you should be demonized for having medical support with that. But the thing that is potentially lacking at the moment is wraparound care. We know that if people go on GLP-1s, if they stop taking them within 12 to 24 months, most people will regain the weight. And so what people need probably more now is support for that behavior change and for managing things like stress if that impacts your eating behaviors, so that if you are taking any of these sort of more either medical routes or sort of nutrition intervention that's usually led by a dietitian, is that you're getting that support during and afterwards. And so essentially it's a very individual approach. Some people will get on well with relatively subtle lifestyle changes. Other people might need to address their relationship with food. Other people might need more intensive support. And so if you do find you're struggling, it might be that you need even if it's a one-off session with someone, just to identify a strategy that could be helpful for you. But I'd say be cautious around an approach that is trying to lose weight too quickly, because it's firstly mentally much harder on you, but also in terms of its sustainability is much less likely to stick. So as much as a cliche, slow and steady can quite often win the race there. So sorry, it's quite a long-winded answer there.
Thank you very much. And I personally take the approach of weight loss being a welcome side effect of things that I'm doing that are generally good for my health, and taking that pressure off of you have to get that scale number down can be very freeing for people with PCOS, because studies show that exercise, eating well are good for you even if you don't lose weight.
Absolutely.
And that's a really important part to remember. They're good for you. You don't have to lose weight to gain that benefit. So
Yeah,
that's not the only way of measuring your improving your health. And that's the other thing is looking at non-scale victories, ways that you can measure improvements in your health without looking at that number.
definitely. Yeah, there's really, really passionate about the fact that you can you can go for health options that are independent of weight. And yes, sometimes there can be a benefit to weight loss, but there's also a benefit to promoting a healthier lifestyle or a better lifestyle for you that doesn't involve worrying overly about what the scales say. But I appreciate that it is often something that's at people's minds, and so I don't want to dismiss that. But yeah, really, really agree with that.
Perfect. And then we have two more questions. One's a secret one that's been sent to me, and it's more medical, so I'll deal with that one. But we'll go for the last nutritional question, which is, will supplements like inositol and fish oil ever truly replace natural sources of these nutrients?
Really nice one. So yeah, like we were saying before, food first is always the sort of approach that we really recommend. I think particularly for things like fish oil, we've got quite a few sort of studies to suggest that you'll get more benefit from having oily fish or other sources of omega-3s than just having the tablet. That being said, they can be very convenient. Things like inositol, you're probably going to struggle to get the amounts that are recommended for PCOS just in the diet. And if you're not someone who has a lot of oily fish, then taking a fish oil or an algal oil can be quite helpful just for topping up those DHA stores. But obviously try and get some other omega-3 sources as well. The main thing is that quite often, if we're eating foods, we're not eating nutrients in isolation. And that's the thing that supplements often miss, is that the benefit of many of these nutrients is often to do with the way that they're packaged. But having some strategic use of supplements can be really, really beneficial. And so it's less about taking as many supplements as you can possibly take, but more about being selective about what is appropriate for your needs as well.
Definitely. we are I'm always talking about targeted nutrition because especially when it comes to supplements, you think that the longer the list, the better it is, but actually there was a massive study that was done that showed that multivitamins don't help you live longer. And that's because you don't need every nutrient in an A to Z multivitamin. And especially when it comes to things like PCOS, other hormonal conditions, like you might need maybe a select few of nutrients to support your needs. And that's why we don't tend to have more than apart from our prenatal, but you don't tend to have more than 5 ingredients in a product. And for example, our magnesium contains nothing but magnesium so that you can top that up because you might want to look into and support your nervous system, supporting your hormonal health that way. So targeted nutrition is so important. That's why you should look for a brand that is choosing good ingredients, specific things to do specific jobs. Otherwise, you are wasting your money on ingredients that you don't need. Thank you so much, Elle. I've got one last question that I'll answer, and it's a medical one. So I'll always preface any medical questions by saying that what I say is educational. I'm not here to replace what your doctor has said to you, so you can't please don't assume that I'm giving you specific advice about your health. This is just a general thing. So the question is that my GP prescribed me cyproterone acetate tablets. So cyproterone acetate is one of the ingredients in the contraceptive pill, basically, and it's often along with estrogen in the form of Dianet, but sometimes it's given on its own as a progesterone only pill. So it has anti-androgenic effects. In terms of what it does, obviously the androgens we talked about, they cause things like acne, they cause facial hair, they cause hair thinning. So you may see benefits in those symptoms when you're using this tablet. However, for me, the contraceptive pill it can be a way of managing PCOS, but it's not a long-term thing for me, because you might want to do other things in your life. You might want to try for children, you might want not, but obviously you can't use these when you're trying for children. And for me, in terms of the impact on my mental health, it wasn't something that I could continue long term. But for everyone's individual, and it's important that you have that really important discussion with your doctor about the pros and the cons of any drug that you go on. What are the risks, what are the benefits, and weigh that up and see, if this drug is making life so much easier for you and you're so much happier, then obviously you might say this is worth it for me. And for other people, they might not see it such a benefit. They might say, actually, I don't want to take this. So it's definitely something that you should discuss with your doctor. And I'm not here to vilify any contraceptive pill. A lot of people do that. I am not going to do that because for some people that is their only way of managing their PCOS. And who am I to sit here and say that that's not good enough? Whatever it takes for us to live with this condition, I accept. But for me, I prefer the dietary supplementary route of things. But remember, everyone's symptoms are different too. So some symptoms are very severe and do require medical intervention. And I think that's also important to know, and not to suffer because you feel like you have to, because so and so gets on fine with inositol, I have to just stick it out with this. We're all individuals. And yeah, that's it from me. Elle, anything else to add?
Yeah, no, if I'll leave medical questions to you, but I think that's a really good sort of summary of how PCOS choices are just so individualistic, and it's about going what's right for you and understanding that there's pros and cons to every choice. But no, I just like to thank everyone for taking time out on your Wednesday to listen to us both speak. I hope it's been helpful, and just thank you very much for having me this evening.
Thank you, everyone who's joined. There is a discount code for you all if you are looking to purchase anything from Polybiotics. You can use the code webinar with the number 10 after it for a 10% discount on all orders, including bundles, including subscriptions. So you can also have a look there. We will be uploading this to YouTube for people to watch again, and for people who couldn't join us. So look, I will watch this space. And thank you very much to Elle, who was a wonderful host, and she did an amazing job. So yes, next week we will be talking about movement. Cannot wait to see you all there. Thank you so much. Have a wonderful evening, everyone. Take care. Bye-bye.